B-2, and it's a very good level platform designed to be able to capture the Western Front. And they continued to produce it up to 1917. Most of the Richthofen's kills were BE-2s. And at the same time, what you find is they have to take the hard journey, understand how to develop aviation from an aerial reconnaissance viewpoint, because they didn't have the industry to back it up. Who did? The Germans. And we're going to see why that is the case in a few minutes. By the way, one of the other leaders is Stefan Branker, right here. Now, for all of us who enjoy World War I, who is the father of the Royal Air Force? Anybody want to venture a guess? Haig, okay, is one. Trenchard, okay, who else? I've mentioned Sir David. I've heard Branker, and I've heard Frederick Sykes. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a problem here. We have to get a DNA test on who is the actual person that conceived the Royal Flying Corps Royal Air Force. They haven't done it justice to that analysis in this field.
Smuts.
Well, there's a guy too, but when you think about it, this is a good item for over the front. Who is the real father? Because you have a lot of conflicts. There's a lot of bad blood between the various members. And Martin Cooper, who wrote that great article about it, makes a comment that all the leaders of the Royal Flying Corps, Royal Air Force, Aviation, hated each other's guts. And that's why you don't have a really convincing argument right now at the present time. So why are we looking at this time before the war? Because this is where the concepts are becoming reality. And the irony of walking through the British conception is that you see clearly before August of 1914, them taking what resources they have and applying aerial reconnaissance concepts to the way they want to fight. But when you do the analysis in the first few weeks of the war, they don't apply that yet. By the way, Jim, this came out of Wikipedia, this shot here. So this is the concentration camp. This is before the term got its evil connotation in World War II. But that's what the Royal Flying Corps had accomplished. They had gotten all of their resources, aviation resources, together in June of 14 to demonstrate what the potential was of aviation and reconnaissance. In fact, they even take a photograph. And I got this photograph off of Flight magazine. I never found it in any of the British manuals and anything like that. And here it is in June of 14, before the war. They're already doing the analysis of the area of the concentration camp. And it was an old Watkis camera. And you find the drama associated with the British conception of air reconnaissance in the fact that they didn't have the industry to produce the camera, unlike the Germans did, unlike the French did. In fact, this is the irony of history, is that because the prevailing attitude was all things British were the reasons why we understood reconnaissance, you find that they did not have a successful camera until February of 15. And we'll talk about that briefly. So here is the pilot cadre of the Royal Flying Corps at the concentration camp. And at the center here is Frederick Sykes. He's the colonel of the military wing, and his boss was David Henderson. But because Trenchard's authors commanded the understanding of what exactly was going to be aviation in the First World War, they saw Frederick Sykes as the villain. Irony of ironies is that when the independent Air Force was stood up, and that was the Handley Cage Force to bomb Germany and such, Trenchard basically got into a fight with the various members, to include Sykes, and quit. And Sykes became the chief of the air staff for the Royal Air Force on the 1st of April, 1918. So this is high drama in the midst of a major war. And again, I haven't seen research that really goes into the detail. I think it'd be worthy of another book, Jim.
Did you say 1918 or?
Royal Air Force was established on 1 April 1918. Royal Flying Corps was established in something in 1912, I think it was.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just wondering where the 19 came from, scene with all the other generals, you know, trying to stab each other in the back.
Well, that's just it, yeah. The donkeys led by, you know, lions, you know. All right, so let's look at another visionary. But look at the rank. He's not 07, he's 02. He's a Lieutenant Carl Fink. Aviation enthusiast, goes to the airfield of Dobritz, where he's a major player in shaping the way that German aviation is going to be applied in the war. One of his mentors is a guy named Ludendorff, who was a visionary, who had a lot of understanding of what exactly was necessary, and oh, by the way, learned how to fly with the initial cadre. Now, why is this manual here? Ladies and gentlemen, this is the first manual for reconnaissance, aerial photographic reconnaissance, 1913, written by Lieutenant Carl Fink. So you can see the whole construct, what's happening in Germany, is taking a major leap at a much more aggressive pace than what was happening in England, or for that matter, France. And thanks to my good best friend, along with Carl, Helmut Jaeger, a native, we now have a better understanding of how Germany shaped the war. Because World War I doesn't sell in Germany today. There's a few folks that go do the hard work, and Helmut's one of them. And here's what Carl Fink developed. But he had the assistance of the Zeiss Corporation and the Gortz Corporation. So they had the best optics in the world, and they developed the Pistolenkamera in 1912. And so you see technology already taking a major leap in Germany as it involves aerial reconnaissance. And, oh, by the way, you have Carl Fink writing up the manual in 1913. You see the German forces start to develop an assembly line of Pistolenkamera and getting them to the aviation units, the Fliegerabteilung. So what you're seeing at the present time with this is infrastructure in place at the start of the war for Germany. What did not happen was they did not have every airplane assigned to the Pistolenkamera. Some Fliegerabteilung at the start of the war did not have any of them at that time. But as the war proceeded, that was a major part of the inventory. So one of the first photos of the entire war is here. Liège, August 14th, a fort in Belgium. And what you're seeing is a photograph, but the analysis behind the photograph still had to be accomplished. And so in the first few weeks of the war, yeah, a few folks take photos, but they hadn't done the restitution, which was the analysis of that photograph and applying it to a cartographical entity, a map. A very important step of aerial photography is the restitution process. So, what happens? The weeks go by, more photographs are being taken. And they're trying to figure out, okay, what exactly can we do with these photographs? Now you have an example in Germany around October of a French fort. Guess what? Now you have the accompaniment of a line drawing that shows where that fort is in location in the cartographical map, a drawing depiction of what exactly is the target and any other additional data that can be applied. There, folks, is the genesis of your air reconnaissance intelligence product. It all comes together around October 14th. Now, when you look at other evolutions, I didn't want to go much into the other leaders of the German forces. Major Wilhelm Siegert was one of the leading aviation advocates in Germany. He had a remarkable career as well, along with Leif Thompson, who was basically the lead aviator for the German forces. But this Osten carrier pigeon detachment was a cover name for one of your first aerial bombardment forces. Now, Steve Sotheby's here to talk about it in detail. Are you ready to go, Steve?
Any minute now.
Okay. What's fascinating about the BAO, the Offset Carrier Precision Detachment, is that not only did they start thinking the process of, okay, we've got the aviation arm, let's start thinking about how we can deliver ordnance, which becomes a main emphasis in the war for all things aviation, taking the combat to the extended ranges. But I wanted to show not the Aviation, which is basically the mainframe airplane for the BAO in 1914. I wanted to address what was the thinking in, I'll stay on this side of it. What was the thinking behind the Talbot, the Dove, one of your first airframes being applied in the war? Seegert had the vision in 1914 of finding a way to take a fleet of Talbots, because they had a lot apparently in their inventory at the time, and they wanted to upgrade to more impressive, more effective airplanes like the Aviation. Find a way to take it off and fly in the direction of England, filled with munitions. And when it ran out of gas, now what does that remind you of, folks? V1, 1944. And this is August of 14 concept. So here we see an Austro-Hungarian attack, C1, about 1915, late 15, early 16. Notice the pistol camera. Okay, so that's the way they held it, and they took all the photographs basically up until the mid-15 time frame. And then they proceeded to upgrade, thanks to the Zeiss design departments and such, into a fleet of cameras. The Fliegerkamera 1, or 1, Fliegerkamera 2, the 50 centimeter. Those two were the mainframe cameras for all your Fliegerabteilung. And then you have a higher echelon unit where you have the Fliegerkamera 3, and then the 120, like that one shot we showed earlier. Those two were the domains of the senior staffs for the Corps, and they assigned them to an elite Fliegerabteilung that belonged to the Corps echelon. So when they wanted high-resolution deep reconnaissance, that's where they applied those cameras. But for most of your Fliegerabteilung reconnaissance, it was the handheld 1 or the 50 centimeter. In the Gorell report, this translation of the overall infrastructure of the German forces has a very revealing comment. Here you see Thompson's name as the Chief of the General Staff of the Air Forces for the German Air Forces. And right below it, you see the German acronym for photography, LB, and look at here, Captain, in this case, Hauptmann Fink. And the words are guiding lines for future development. In other words, the translation of this very important document makes the case that they saw Fink as one of their most important visionaries for the role of aviation. And here it is in the entire general staff and infrastructure. So, was that a grunt or is that... By the way...
It was a interesting blurb. How's that?
Feel free to shout out interesting blurbs. Because one of the things I want, this is family now, this is time for sharing ideas. You know, I can stand up here in automaton and talk incessantly, but it's getting late and I want folks to stay somewhat awake. And I'd like to be able to say, let's share what ideas we've uncovered in the research.
A hell of a good idea.
Good. I'm glad you agree.
In that case, I have a question.
Please, go ahead.
So you showed a series of the cameras, the 4 cameras
Yeah.
earlier, and you talked about the 1 and 2 as being for sort of general photography, and the other ones, which appeared to be longer focal length cameras,
Yeah.
for more precision. Generally speaking, for the last 70-odd years, longer focal length has meant you could just fly at a higher altitude.
Yes.
For the same resolution of imagery.
Yes.
So, are you suggesting that they use longer focal length at the same altitude for greater resolution?
Well, that's just it. The assignment within the German infrastructure was just that. It was the elite Fliegerabteilung got the 70 and the 120.
Right.
But on the French side, which we'll see shortly, the 120 and the 52 centimeter were assigned to almost all of their aerial reconnaissance units. Likewise, with the British, they had their camera suite. It wasn't as sophisticated as what we have at Germany, but they did have that capability too for a longer. And oh, by the way, when you're planning an attack for a major op, you want to get as high a resolution of that particular battlefield. We'll see a snap in a few minutes that gives you that impression. So feel free to ask the question again if you don't get the answer when you see it. All right, Carl Bobrow will now talk to you for the next 10 minutes on Ulian, and we'll get an appreciation for what exactly has been the Russian role. Before I had met Carl, obviously, like most people on this planet, we were just totally ignorant to what the Russians had accomplished. And that's because, obviously, they were the Soviets, and what did they do that was of any value? Because the Romanovs were very pathetically arraigned in terms of the way they managed the war and such. But they had brilliant people in the service. Now, Carl and I are working together, and this is hard on the head to really clearly understand how the Russian military evolved up until the time the war was initiated. It wasn't for the good intentions. It was just basically the fact that the applications of the weight of power that the royal family had on the decision-making process for the military clearly affected how they could establish a very vibrant aviation force. They had great minds like Ulianin, and Ulianin was a colonel, and he worked out of their brain trust here at Gachina Airfield in St. Petersburg. And here is where the school was. Here was where most of the aviation ideas were captured for Russia. But people have a bad vibe about Russia because you don't see any indigenous designs except for mainly Sikorsky's. And so the tendency is just to blow them off because the Russians basically flew mostly French and when they could get them British airplanes. But what Ulianin does, besides develop the infrastructure, he was a balloonist, by the way, an aeronaut, and that's basically how he got his roots. But he was also into aerial camera development. And so he develops the mainstay aerial camera for the Russians in the war, the Ulianin, which is about 20 centimeter. And this guy is modeling the latest in winter wear. When we look at, here's the camera, case in point, could be 1915, 1916, we're in Solomon 4, a French design which was not very well employed in the Western Front. But when we think about the Eastern Front, now I live in California now. If you take a state of California and you went from St. Petersburg, it would get you down to Lemberg. So if anybody's driven from the southern border of California up to the northern border, it's about 1,200 kilometers as the crow flies. So envision California on the Eastern Front, and you get an impression of a vast wasteland of territory where aviation could basically fly unimpeded. It isn't like in the Western Front, especially over the northern Flanders area, where every square inch was examined because of the high risk associated with the ability to fight the war. So most of the aviation was crammed on the northern part of the Western Front. Not the case in the Eastern Front. So here's a photograph from Ulianin. You saw those two dials below. One's the clock, time of the photograph, and the other one is the aerial barometer, kind of give you an idea of the altitude. Ulianin also took the development process one step further, total flexibility. So the field commander at the landing ground could have his own photo lab, and here it is. Take the plates off the plane, put it in this two-wheel cart, and get the photos, the prints made. Yes. Now, we'll have a memorial for Nesterov, because this is Carl's hero, and I think it's appropriate that we have a moment of silence. In all seriousness, aviation innovation, you should think about Nesterov at the same time you think about others, the Wright brothers and everything else. what Nesterov accomplished was he was one of the first people in the world to fly an airplane and conduct a successful loop. He was very brave. He was not of the right culture in the Russian orthodoxy, but it didn't matter because he was so brilliant and brave, and he had commanded the respect of his colleagues and others. So he basically led. In the Galatian campaign, fighting the Austro-Hungarians, around September 6th, thereabouts, he understands the definite impact of aerial reconnaissance on the conduct of the battle. And so what happens is he sees an Austro-Hungarian airplane coming back from the front lines and recognizes that the information they probably captured or collected on the Russians at that time was probably so significant, he makes a critical decision. He rams the plane and kills everybody, himself and the two aviators in the Austro-Hungarian plane. So this is around the 6th of September 1914. Yes?
According to one account, Nesterov just planned to ram the Austrian plane's upper wing with his landing gear, hoping that the plane would crash. Unfortunately for him, the planes got entangled and they both crashed.
Yeah.
So it's not quite the suicide.
Well,
You're right, but he had done previous attempts with entanglement by using a blade on the tail skid to cut the top wing. He was a very accomplished pilot, and so this maneuver was not to ram and destroy, but to ram and disable. But it was a ram. It was a purposeful collision.
and it ended up killing them all. Yes, John.
The accounts I've seen of the two Austro-Hungarians involved had tried to bomb his aerodrome the day before, and he made an unsuccessful attempt to intercept them. And when they turned up the next day, same people, he went up and tried a new technique, which worked in a way, but they
It was a reconnaissance run. It was a reconnaissance run. And bombing was an opportunistic effort.
well, it got him mad.
We'll have Steve confirm the interval bargain roll. Okay, you will in the future. But what's important about this is that Nesterov remains in the hearts of all Russian aviation. And oh, by the way, in 1925, he's declared a hero of the Soviet Union for his act, his selfless act in terms of trying to destroy the Austrian threat. Another heartthrob for Carl, Igor Sikorsky. Why is this guy important? An incredible mind. And here's an Action Jackson kind of guy. He'd make Trump proud because he did no things with his business. But the thing about significant about Sikorsky is he was so far ahead of every other aviation design by the time of the war started. And again, it's part of the bias. We don't see much. When I did the editions of World War I, thanks to Carl, I was able to get data and information on the airplane itself. But when you think about what he accomplished in his lifetime, particularly, again, before the war, with the design of the Biennial units. Now, Ted, this is a frontline banner item out of the Omaha Bee in September of 13. And that gives you an appreciation for, here it is, there's Sikorsky wearing his helmet. I forget, you know the gentleman, is that Shivlovsky in the Senate?
Kobars.
Is that Kobars?
That's Kobars.
All right. And the guy in the middle there, as Carl has identified, he is the lead aviation manager for the Northern Front, the one that engages the Germans at Tannenberg. The other one was Michalski. Michalski? How do I pronounce that guy's name?
Nikolsky?
Yeah, Michalski?
For
You have Kobars in the north and you have
Mikhailovich.
Mikhailovich. Thank you. senior moment. But what you have there is the lead for the Russian Aviation Corps, if you want to call it that, in the northern front opposite Tannenberg in the middle. And he's getting excited about aviation thanks to what Sikorsky's developed. Now, the EDK is developed in 1914, your squadron flying ships, and as they build more Miromets, and it's one of the sad stories, because here it is, they had this incredible airplane, and it isn't until 1915 they really started getting the production line well in place, and the generals start to see the value of the role of the Miromets. There's one general, I think his name is Kulikov, something like that, I can't remember now, I'm sorry about that, but when he saw the Miromets at the parking apron for the first time, he ran back to his car screaming, "Cars of Satan." So these are the psychologies you're dealing with here as involves Russian leadership. They don't know how to really apply something that's so advanced. So remember the date, 12 April 1915. One of these takes off, this could be the one, off of the Blana airfield near Warsaw, flies up into eastern Prussia. This is after Tannenberg now. This is April 15. They got an intel guy on board the crew. They got Ilyanin and Pote cameras. Pote is a film camera, not a plane camera like Ilyanin. And they proceed to cruise all over Prussia, northeast Prussia. And they use up all the film. And they find out where all the Germans are in northeast Prussia in that one sortie. It was a 5-hour mission. You don't get any better than that in reconnaissance. And it's totally forgotten in history. I'll give you a comparison to what we saw on the Western Front in a few minutes, but that was this one story. My conundrum with Carl is that we don't have the depth of data that we need to really ask the right questions. Why didn't Stavka, which was the high-ranking command for the Russians, start making this a daily operation? Now, granted, you didn't have enough airframes, but in terms of knowledge gained, the fact that they were covering a major strategic area of the Northern Front, and one sortie covers it in 5 hours. Now, this is going to make Steve Sotheby's heart palpitate, because we're going to see a secondary mission, Steve. I know that would make Carl feel better too. But the point is, obviously, you have an airframe that can lift that, was it 500 kg? So that incredible feat. And oh, by the way, they had a bathroom. What does that tell you about state of the art?
That they could bomb the Germans.
Oh, wait, here's the leader of the works, the Baltic works that builds the airplane, Shevlovsky, and here's Sikorsky. Jeez. Well, I'll use a laser pointer.
Don't touch Sikorsky.
All right, let's go back to the Western Front. What you have is the French developing their aerial reconnaissance capability at a very rapid pace, too. In fact, that's one of the ironies of history, is that what they accomplished has been overlooked significantly. Thank God I was able to get to Vincennes and find the data on Maurice Grew and get an understanding of what he accomplished. But the same date, in April of 15, Maurice flies a sector of the Western Front in a testbed boy zone. And they use a little Swiss camera, aerial camera, that's in that package there. And it has like 30 meters of film. And so they were able to fly this particular sector. And because of that, they went back and processed it and found all the artillery positions in that particular sector from that one sortie. And then they fed that information to the artillery units for counter battery. And they proceeded to destroy that German artillery emplacement. So that's where they are in state of the art for France in April of 15, as involves their role with aerial reconnaissance. But they shift away from that one film camera, because film had a propensity to have static electricity, and didn't work very well with a very vibrating platform. So they stuck with plates for most of the war. The French suite of cameras, Gru was mostly responsible for the design of these. Again, he used aeronaut capabilities for balloonists to be able to figure out how to apply that. So the 120 is the longest one. The 52 or the 50, and by the way, in the museum, about 30 yards from here, you have an actual F-26 camera in the display. The Automatique is a film camera that became operational in August of 18 because they decided, hey, we can do something with film. Oh, by the way, that was held by a guy named George Eastman from Rochester, New York, who liked the idea of using film as opposed to plates. And he made a case for it through his staffs. Then there's a telephoto. But the French suite of cameras was the main frame of cameras for the Allies. Now, we're talking about what can you cover with a camera. Let me see, let's read this. I don't want to make more. Here you have your 120. See right there. This is alpha. High resolution. Get the data you need on what exactly is that particular target doing at that particular point. Then you have a broader area coverage with Bravo. That's your 50 centimeter right there. And then you have your broad, wide area panoramic view, and that's what that 26 centimeter, like you'll see in the display case. That was the suite of cameras for the most part by all the combatants. So here's a case in point. You have the Maurice Farman 11 bis, a workhorse, 1915, 1916, and they're trying to figure out a way, okay, fine. Instead of having this camera vertically loaded up and down to get the cartographical image that you would like to apply for restitution, they want to survey the battlefield through an oblique shot. So what you have is this kind of view with an oblique shot. Here you got your battlefield, and you got the troops, maybe some gas being emitted, and you got the troops in the trench right there. But that gives you the oblique view. That would be the best view for your combatant colleagues who are going to do the charge over no man's land. And Gru is the one that developed the infrastructure of photographic development and dissemination, the SPAE. And you can see they had a mobile van. It was a little more complicated than what Ulianen had, but this is the main infrastructure for how they develop. So we go from development of the photographic arena in France, and now what we're going to see is the interpretation evolution for the First World War. Two masterminds for photographic interpretation, Jean Debussy and Lieutenant Eugene Papin. Of the two, Papin, again my attempt at French. Papin, thank you. He is the one who basically develops all the master research and photographic manuals. So you give him, he's the brains behind the inception, and he is the one who builds it. Papin is a lawyer by trade, but he's also brilliant. His career in the entire war, not only did he do what I just described, he built the manuals, he also became the personal advisor to Pershing in 1918 on how we can apply aerial photography to the conduct of the AEF. So let's take a photograph that Jim Streffrey stole for his book. You have, out of the French manual, you have the barbed wire fields here. Okay, that's what you're seeing. Again, understanding about aerial photography, particularly in the Western Front, the analysis was so intense, they were able to conduct a clear understanding of almost every facet of that photograph, where the troops were, what weapons were in place, and so on and so on. And then they have the accompaniment line drawing, as you can see there's your barbed wire. You get an appreciation for, quickly see what you're trying to understand is that photograph. And then they apply that information to the master targeting vehicle, the tool, the plan director. Oops, excuse me. And it's multicolored because each color has a purpose. The legend has all the particular threats in place so that you can understand where exactly does that threat lie in the battlefield that you're going to be conducting war against in a positional operation. So here you are with aerial photography, and you're getting all this intense analysis, and you're trying to understand every square meter of the Western Front, and to a degree the Eastern Front. Now they want to screw up the works, because now you have camouflage and deception developing at a rapid rate. And for all of us who are art enthusiasts who like the guy Picasso, in that time of the 20th century, the Cubist art, which basically you imagine what is reality, and in turn you develop it according to your own imagination. And then one of the camoufleurs, Andre Marr, his self-portrait kind of gives you that appreciation.
Did he wrinkle the canvas when he did that?
He could have, it's Cubist. Do whatever you want to, do your own thing. But it's your imagination that's being applied here. And why is that important? Because when you understand camouflage and deception, you're trying to disrupt your enemy's interpretation of what exactly is that reality. So here we are. The Western Front becomes camouflage for the most part. Here you have a track for the rail networks that resupply the front lines and such. And then you have your camouflage netting. Major industry come 1918 on the Western Front. Now, does anybody want to venture a guess where this was, this particular operation here?
In France.
Close. Sorry? Anybody go to Cornell University in this room? Anybody been to Ithaca, New York? Ithaca, New York, folks. This is the schoolhouse for photography in World War I for the United States at Ithaca, New York. So they developed this trench network, built the camera that you're seeing there, and then they flew Jenny sorties to help the photographic interpreters know what photography working against camouflage deception was all about. But the weapon of choice wasn't just looking at the one shot. If you understand the three-dimensional, where you're trying to get the two overlapping to basically bring up the features, you have to use a stereoscope. And that was the key weapon in fighting camouflage and deception in the war. So you look at the way sorties are conducted and the overlap of photography in a perfect aerial reconnaissance run. It was to acquire that so that stereoscopes could be put into play. So let's look at the three amigos here that were part of the brain trust for the English and American role in aerial photography. You have Major Laws. You have a mental block here.
Major mental block.
Yeah, I'll get to him in 1 second. And then you have more Brabazon. Come on, it's the world's most famous photographer of World War II. No, Steichen, yeah. So you have Laws, Steichen, and more Brabazon. These three gentlemen in the English-speaking world were the world's leaders of understanding air photography. So let's go to more Brabazon. He's the first guy to fly an airplane in Britain. He won the first air race in Britain. In 1909, Flight Magazine made him a flight pioneer. And then in 1914, he's basically asked to come on board. He's already earned his pilot's wings. And they said, okay, would you like to help us out and go to a 3 squadron? Because that's where we're getting all the smart guys together. So More Brabazon shows up at 3 squadron, and he meets Laws, because Laws, I'll show you some more about Laws in a second. And they start developing what became the infrastructure for British air reconnaissance. A applying the photographs which have been acquired for some of their aviation initiatives. And then they come up with a camera, the A-type camera, which became one of the first mainframe cameras for the British forces. In this case, you see the British photographs, you see the accompanying data that describes, in this case, the boat shop for the reserve area of the front. That's where the Germans mainly had most of their troops waiting in line for any attacks conducted by the enemy to the north. More Brabazon's colleague, Major Frederick Laws. He was an enlisted man when he was flying before the war. And the story I love is that he didn't want to become an officer because he didn't want to pay club bills. But he did, and he became a lieutenant. And this right here, for those, that's the Royal Observer, Aerial Observer Badge. Now, I have to tell this every time I tell this briefing. You know what the aviators call this? The flying asshole, yes. So, but Laws eventually gets his wings, you can see here. But he has an incredible ability to build the camera that basically helped the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Air Force conduct the operations that they had. In this case, it was the L-type camera. That was his design. And here's the plunger for shooting the photograph. That's his shutter mechanism. And in this case, here's a British pusher, and you see the L-type over the edge. They could put some cameras in this particular FE2 for oblique shots, but the mainframe was hung over the side. Okay, Ed Steichen. How can I forget you, Ed? The thing about Steichen that's very important is he was a photographic genius before the war. And so when America showed up and Steichen came to the conferences and such, it was like the A-team arrived because he understood photography better than anybody else on the planet. Now here he is in front of a Brigade 14-2B, which is the bomber variant. And thanks to Jim and Steve, I finally figured out why they had glass for the bomber variant so they could have light for the aiming device when they flew their bombing sorties, isn't that correct? And the A-type, which was the reconnaissance variant of Brigade 14, did not have the windows there. And I think it also because they didn't want to have any additional light showing up in the area where the film plates were. That's my conjecture. But here is Flieger Cameron Eins. And it shows you that Ed knew his cameras and the ability to handle them. So what you see, obviously, is the Americans coming late to the game. They're going to inherit a lot of this ability to fly and fight. And so that the schoolhouse in Cornell, they see themselves as the eyes of the Army, and they're taking out the Kaiser personally. And they're proud of their inventory of cameras because, notice here, they're all French. Go out of this room, go see this camera here, the 26 centimeter. You have the Grand Champ, which is the same type of focal length as the regular panoramic, but it had a wider format for photograph. And then you have 450 centimeter cameras. And then over here, you have the Durand, which was a semi-automatic camera developed by an aerial observer who personally shot down 4 Germans as an aerial observer. And he came up with a semi-automatic camera that had about 50 plates on board. And it had mixed reviews. Some guys liked it. Steichen loved this camera and its potential, and that's one reason why the U.S. bought it. So here we have the 15 photo section showing off their inventory of cameras that they were working with. A couple 120s. Here's the, you see that's your Grand Champ. I'm sorry, there's Grand Champ there. Here's the 50 centimeters, another 50 centimeter here, and 50 centimeter here. But look at this camera here. That's a German camera we're going to talk about shortly. And that's the camera that kind of makes a difference for a lot of the reconnaissance the Germans accomplished. So here's Ed Steichen with his staffs in Paris, Major Steichen. And by the way, Jim, I got this off of some art display of his work in a website. So for your second edition. But the point is that Steichen, highly respected, and he basically, he made it clear that if you had a fuzzy photograph, he was going to court-martial you. So that's the kind of guy he was. He was a perfectionist. Now let's shift to another leading aviator. That's short. Yeah.
Go back one again.
Yes.
Who's the woman?
She was the madam. No clue. Can
He
you
would pick at, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
She might have been the cook.
Yeah, could have been.
She
Yeah.
may have been communications for telephone.
Well, yeah, you got it. Yeah, one of those dollies. Let's talk about Paul Louis Weiler, which is a fascinating thing because just for grins, I went on Google this week to see if there's any new data on him, and it's almost like he's gone off the web. I think they mentioned it thanks to Jim's book that Paul Louis Weiler had something to do with World War I. But if you do an image search, this painting comes up, which I still love. I think it's great. What did Weiler do? First of all, he was an ex-artillery guy. By the way, I have to say right up front, he was born and raised in Alsace. He comes from a Jewish family. They converted to Christianity, and that plays in the story, which I'll tell about shortly. What Weiler did was his role in the development of French air reconnaissance was incredible. I mean, he shot down airplanes, incredibly brave. He had like about 15 Croix de Guerres, all the things that an aviator would love. He was like the Gunnemer. He was just one of those highest esteemed aviators for the French forces. But he established a strategic reconnaissance force called the Groupement Weiler. And one of the escadrille, those 3 escadrille brigades that were assigned, 220, and they flew the Army strategic regions in the back areas of the German lines. And that was their job, was to figure out what was going on back there. In this case, you have a possible training field in this area here where they're conducting training exercises for an attack. Marshal Foch basically said to Weiler, look, I'm going to make decisions based on what you can provide for air reconnaissance. And so what you see in this map, and it's hard to see, but that's the way it is, you have the targets set in the rear echelons that Weiler covered with his escadrilles. And then Foch decided, okay, if the Germans are massing here, I want to attack here. And that was part of the strategy. At the end of the war, Foch awarded Weiler the Legion of Honor. What happened to Weiler? Well, he was no dummy. He's a leader in French aviation. He's on the board of Renault. He's on the board of the French Airlines, one of the senior people. He owns the Nome factory for building engines in the 20s and 30s. And because of his Jewish ancestry, he needs to get out of Dodge when Vichy France is formed. In fact, he was captured by the Vichy, and then I think they respected him for what he had accomplished in the previous war, so he was allowed to escape. Now you got a scene out of Casablanca, where he escapes to Morocco, and then he gets to Cuba, and then he goes up into the United States, and he ends up in a place called Reno, Nevada, and he hides out for the rest of the war. But the point is, he gets back to France after the war, he reestablishes the French industry that he did, and when I was doing early searches of him 10 years ago, the only thing they had on Weiler is he had one of the world's largest diamonds. And oh, by the way, he was a good buddy of Richard Nixon. So you can take it from there. And interesting enough, these guys I'm talking about, they all had long lives. Weiler lived to 100, as did more Brabazon.
What's that like?
The woman in the other photograph?
98. So let's go back to Deutschland for a second. Jim in his book mentioned an aerial observer on the German side, and I asked him, hey, what about Fricke? And Jim said, hey, listen, I don't know everybody on the German side, and that's understood because I didn't either. But somehow I got the indication, I think, from Helmut, that we need to look at Fricke.
Of course it was.
Of course. Or if it was from Dieter Groschning. point from all this is that our knowledge of the air reconnaissance side of the German and Austro-Hungarian still needs a little work. But when we get the first volume out on the Russian aviation, Russland, whatever we're going to call it, you'll be able to get a more in-depth understanding of how the German Air Force was established. And people like this guy, Finnegan, will come to the service.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
go back. And what is he awarded there?
Oh, thank you. Are you my straight man?
Yeah.
Like Jim had mentioned on the other guy in his book, Fricker got the Croix de Merit in 1917. Why? Because he was an aviator supreme. He didn't play in the Jagdstaffel and shoot down planes, but he flew 160 aerial reconnaissance missions. That's a lot of missions.
Without getting shot down?
Without getting shot down. And at the same time, he applies his knowledge of how to fight to the way he conducts reconnaissance. So, in the middle of the war, he tells the German aviation leadership, I need to get to the front. So he commands a company for 6 months. And he understands what the infantry are going through. It's kind of like that first shot where the infantry is looking at the 120 centimeter and they're scratching their head, what does it mean? He does it. He walks the walk. He gets in the lines with his infantry colleagues and understands what it takes to fight a positional war. But he has assisting him, which comes out in 1617, the Ryan Builder camera. And this is your overlapping film camera, unique, but it gives you that coverage that you need to do the stereoscopic analysis. Oh, by the way, look at the broad area. Now, what we had to do with the Allied side was they took many plates, and then they had to develop the plates into pictures and then cut them together and put together a mosaic. You have here an instant mosaic with the Ryan Builder camera. They also had obviously great airplanes. I'm not going to talk about German airplanes. You guys are the experts in the planet. But one of the things about the Rumpler is that ceiling is about 6,000 meters. And Eddie Rickenbacker talks about in his book about trying to shoot a Rumpler down. Well, think about the cameras that they have in this particular airplane. Again, it's a higher echelon assigned airplane because it can fly at higher altitude. They have oxygen tanks for breathing and so on and so on. And then the Rumpler has either the 120 or the 70 or the Ryan Builder camera. Now what are they capable of doing? Cover the battlefield. So here is a Ross area outside of the northern western front, just south of Flanders. Look at all that coverage. This is the key map. Every darkened area shows you what they have a photograph of. So where this gentleman made his mark in terms of getting the Croix de Merit is that he develops the architecture for coverage on the northern western front. And so when they do their analysis, getting ready for Operation Michael on 21 March 1918, they have data in place. Whereas you saw from the Weiler strategic map, a blip here, blip there, but look at this broad swath, of coverage. Yes? Is that a question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Right. So there's one of the developments associated with the German ability to plan for a battle. They have the technology, and they're applying it. By the way, they're using state-of-the-art cameras. Another camera was Stabskamera, which had a wider format, and it was only assigned by the Army headquarters and put on the Rumpler. So they had a larger format, high resolution, the best optics that Zeiss could build. And so they could fly at 20,000 or 18,000 feet and get the best clear photograph possible. But that was only assigned by the Army staffs. Now, sorry? Somebody sneezed. So when we talk about how this all comes together, it's important to understand that the Germans developed the infrastructure associated with collecting information on all intelligence sources, having it fused. All the Allies did for the most part, but it's the Stabia, which basically we're looking at here, that shows you how they did it. Here's the airplanes, here's the balloons, here's the signals, and here's the other ground observations. And they get that data to the Stabia, which is assigned to the Corps headquarters or co-located with it. They usually have a Fliegerabteilung assigned as well to give them more in-depth information. But that information is fused together, and it's the fusion center that provides the information that you need to conduct the next operation. Now, why am I high on Stabia? Because the book I wrote about the Seychelles battle, comes out of the Steichen photo album in the Garber facility. And you have on April 17th or 18th, 1918, a fusion of data. You have a mosaic from all the all the play cameras that they had, possibly even an occasional Rhine builder. And all the key targets are outlined here. They tell you where the flak unit is. They tell you where the artillery is stationed. This is the most recent information, and then 2 days later they conduct a major operation, which is the subject of my second book. So let's kind of wind down, and let's talk about the U.S. Air Service. Because I think what we need to see is how things are evolving and how it culminates in the roles that the U.S. Air Service conducted in terms of operations. This was one of the cover articles from Over the Front from a few years ago, Stanley Walsh's article. And it's a great art shot, one of the first sorties over the Western Front by the Americans. The first Aero Squadron, which we're going to talk about, had as their emblem the American flag. So, one of the fascinating things about being able to do research in history is that there's a lot of stories that have not been told. I'm researching about this battle in Seychelles, and I know a lot about it because I've looked at all the angles, the French, the German, and the American. And all of a sudden I find out there's this guy named Lieutenant Kenneth Pickens Colbert who's on the roster of the 1st Aero Squadron. Oh, by the way, Colbert, a Marine, flies a sortie with a guy named Barney Barnaby, and they proceed to do a lot of chaos, provide a lot of chaos to the German echelons during the Battle of Seychelles. The German command reflects on the fact that they were a nuisance to the conduct of their battle. The French awarded Kenneth Pickens Colbert a Croix de Guerre. He is the first decorated Marine aviator in the history of the Marine Corps. The Marines don't know about him.
Now they do.
Yes, because a guy named Terry Finnegan called him and said, "Have you ever heard of Ken Pickens?" And he said, "No." "Let me tell you about your history." And for those of you who know what the Marines are, they tell you everything about their history. So I'm having a great time, and we're going to get this published in the next couple, as a winter edition, for the Over the Front, talk about the history of what Ken Pickens Colbert did. So I took great pleasure in that as an Air Force officer, thinking of my colleagues in the Marine Corps. Yeah. But amazing about Ken Pickens, here is the actual area that they were working in the months of April and May. And here is the, okay. Understand, thanks to Carl, he did the actual search at Gorel and found this was an actual photograph. And here's the Seychelles area. Here's the front lines of the Seychelles area. And what you have here is the key map showing the 1st Aero Squadron's coverage of the German echelons. Oh, by the way, this area here was aerial coverage of the artillery positions of American forces to find out how well their camouflage and deception was being applied. But up here is where they were obviously trying to figure out where the enemy was. Again, here's the Seychelles area right here. Colbert flies with a guy named Barney Barnaby. He was from Oklahoma, one of the best aviators in the force. This morning we had the pleasure of going over to the research center, found some more information on Barney. and Ken Pickens. On the 22nd of May, a few weeks later, Pickens Colbert flies another pilot, and they do a low-level strafe and do a lot of damage on the German side. He is awarded posthumously the Silver Star. The first American aviator, or Marine aviator to be awarded that decoration. Sadly, a week later, Barney and Ken take off in a Stat 11, which had a problem with its motors. Now look at it this way. You're coming to the fight, and you don't have the infrastructure on board, the industry on board, underway to build airplanes, so you got to take what the French can give you, in this case Stat 11s. So they had a lot of problems in motors, and they took off 100 meters above the ground, the motor quits, they crash, both are killed. If Ken Pickens Colbert had lived and survived the war, I would see him as definitely a general officer. Oh, I forgot to mention, Harvard graduate, one. Number two, captain of the crew team at Harvard. Just an exceptional career. Oh, by the way, he's your first joint aviator, joint officer aviator. And for us in the military, joint assignments are very important. You know, all the services working together. So it's a great story, totally forgotten in history. So what happens with the first Aero Squadron? They're trying to learn their trade, and what you find is you see a evolution, not just to acquire information, but to be more warrior-like. And that's the discussion that I wanted to conclude with, is that aerial reconnaissance requirements still continue, but for the most part, what you see in the U.S. Air Service is they're trying to become just as effective a fighter element as they were a reconnaissance element. Now, they fly infantry contact missions close to the ground, and they're creating havoc. Now, keep on point here. John Goodman can talk about the guy on the right, because he wrote the book on the guy. That's Irwin, Lieutenant Irwin. He had, is it 8 or 9 kills? I think he had, I've seen 9, I've seen 8. And notice he has a Distinguished Service Cross on his chest, along with a Croix de Guerre. That was his first Distinguished Cross, Service Cross. We'll see the second one shortly. Now, the guy on his left is a guy named Arthur Coyle. What you see with Arthur Coyle is an early aviator, and just last week, you know, I'm saying, I'm going to be talking to you, I've got to find out what Arthur Coyle really did in the war, other than he was a squadron commander. Ladies and gentlemen, he's your first National Guard airman. He came out of New Hampshire. They sent him to school in Virginia to learn how to fly. He learned how to fly when about 15 or 16. He's a small guy, he only weighs about 140 pounds. But he commanded the respect of his fellow squadron mates. They called him the judge. And I'm going to have the pleasure of briefing the National Guard leadership in New England in 2 weeks. And I'm going to introduce him to Arthur Coyle. Because there's a story that's not been told yet. The first National Guard aviator. So when we look at the accomplishments of the first Aero Squadron, again, reconnaissance, infantry contact, and all that stuff, those are understood missions. But what you find is heroic actions by the aircrew in fighting the enemy. And so what you have here are 3 aviators, Irwin being in the middle, Vern Bockham from Texas, Irwin from Chicago, and Art Easterbrook from New York. Both of them earned 2 Distinguished Service Crosses in the few months that they were on the line working in the San Mael sector and the Meuse-Argonne sector. In fact, in one sortie, Irwin and Bockham fought infantry contact. The plane crashed. They took the machine guns out from the plane, and they proceeded to fight the Germans with the machine guns off their planes. Escaped, got back to the Allied lines, and then Vern Bockham got back to the squadron by riding on a horse. Great stories. But the point from our discussion here is that they were obviously trying to contribute more to the warfight as possible. And I find this shot very interesting because this is post-war, 1919 in Germany. Here's the 1st Aero Squadron, the Samsung aeroplane. And notice the label, oops, excuse me. 1st Pursuit Squadron. So they aren't looking at reconnaissance at this time, and somebody either made a mistake or they wanted to suggest that, hey, we're capable of fighting just as effectively as the Eddie Rickenbackers. So, what's the secret weapon here in this particular war? Well, a massive aerial camera, or in this case, Photoshop. But what you can see is, when you got photo experts in the room, they know how to slice and dice and put together what you see here.
That's a big camera, Terry.
It was amazing. It's almost as amazing as this camera. When I had the pleasure of briefing the cadets at the Air Force Academy, one cadet stood up and says, "Is that a ray gun?" I said, "Yeah."
No, it's not Ray, it's Lois.
So what you have, obviously, the discussion we've had for the last hour, and I hope it hasn't drawn too much of people to sleep, but what you have is an amazing evolution that we, who are the most fascinated people on the planet on this era and its aviation contributions, should remember that air reconnaissance was the mainstay. It was the purpose for the most part. Being a warfighter is critical, but it's how you acquire that information and how you process it and disseminate it. That's the story that's being told now. And with that is my book, and here's